Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending where you're joining from today. My name is Shane Hampshire with RTI International, and I'll be your Zoom technical support and host for this afternoon's webinar. Just a few logistical announcements before we get going today. If you need any technical assistance, or if you'd like to submit questions for our presenters and panelists today, please use the Q&A panel on your Zoom toolbar. I'll be happy to help you troubleshoot with anything you're experiencing. Also, we do have live captioning enabled for today. You can manage that individually on your screen by clicking on the CC button on your Zoom toolbar and selecting show or hide subtitles. So we have a great event today. We hope you can stay for the duration. Unfortunately, if you're unable to stay, we are recording and we'll be archiving today's webinar for later viewing. So thank you so much for being here. Once again, if you need any help, please use the Q&A and you can submit questions throughout today's presentations for our question and answer session at the conclusion of today's webinar. Now I'll hand things over to Carrie Ann to get us going. Carrie Ann, over to you.
Thank you, Shane. Hello, my name is Carrie Ann Tucker-Muse, and I am the Strategic Account Executive for RTI International's Center for Disease Control and Prevention account. I want to personally welcome all of you to today's Tech Talk, where RTI will walk you through a presentation on using experimental case designs to evaluate and develop culturally sensitive and responsive interventions. We are so glad you're spending this time with us, and I will be your moderator for today. We have three folks on our speaker panel today, including Dallas Elgin, Lori Hinnett, and Ty Reidenauer. And I will ask each speaker to just repeat their name and their RTI title before they begin speaking. With discussions of data modernization dominating the federal landscape right now, RTI is acutely aware of how important it is not to just iterate on current methods for data collection and scientific study. We also know that advancing the technology is not enough, but there needs to be a bridge between how we collect and store data and how we advance methods to get answers to new questions. A few days ago, RTI hosted a tech talk on the importance of equity and data modernization, and this talk is very much related because experimental case designs are sensitive to the impact of programs on marginalized populations. There are several reasons to use experimental case designs, which we will cover today. We want to use them in addition to traditional, expensive, representative national evaluation methods that measure impact. In this presentation, in fact, we will illuminate how ECDs can identify impacts earlier than other designs and how they can provide critical data to inform program adjustments while using smaller sample sizes and hopefully less burden. Overall, this method is a game-changing tool, we believe, especially as it relates to the evaluation and development of culturally sensitive and responsive interventions. So with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Lori Hinnett.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie Ann, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Lori Hinnett. I am a community health psychologist here in RTI's health practice area. And so I'm going to ask to advance this slide and we'll give you all an overview of our presentation. So during today's talk, we're going to discuss advancing health equity and limitations of commonly used study designs. We're going to provide an overview of experimental case designs, including benefits, opportunities, and examples of use for in-health equity research. And we are going to make sure that we allow plenty of time for questions at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So health equity is an evaluation priority across most funding agencies. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly emphasized persistent inequities in access, resources, and increased mistrust, especially among marginalized populations and hard-to-reach populations. Lessons learned should and are changing program implementation and evaluation, so we must be responsive to these new challenges and recognize that the current best practices may not be sensitive to the evolving evaluation needs and landscape. Next slide. So we've laid out here some public health evaluation gaps, and they really do speak to evaluation needs as well. These needs include increasing representation of marginalized and hard-to-reach populations in evidence-based interventions, which can be designed and fielded quickly with findings, yielded and communicated to populations and partners in a timely manner. The field is also in need of evaluation designs that can be conducted with smaller sample sizes, those that are more budget friendly, and those that minimize burden on groups involved in the evaluation. Next slide. With this in mind, innovation and evaluation design, evaluations need to be responsive to the intersectionality of factors that may impact evaluation. And we've laid out some of these intersectionalities here. Vulnerabilities of marginalized communities can prevent them from participating in implementation and evaluation. Visible differences in terms of gender, ethnicity, skin color, age, clothing, or communication barriers, including language differences between researchers and marginalized communities, might discourage marginalized communities from trusting, communicating, or working with what are often seen as outsider researchers. The intersectionality of these factors can compound inequities and worsen the problem. Sensitivity and responsiveness to these factors are required to reduce undesirable evaluation outcomes, including negative consequences for marginalized populations. Each of us brings a variety of backgrounds and experiences to our projects, making us well-rounded, relatable, and well-poised to serve diverse populations. For example, my name is Lori. I am a cisgender heterosexual woman who uses the pronouns she, her, hers. I identify as white, and I live in the South, but I was raised in the North and can easily move from y'all to wicked cool. Don't tell anyone, but I recently turned 50, so I guess I'm now firmly middle-aged, and due to my advanced education level, I'm considered upper middle class. The diversity that we bring to the table is an asset to our work. Next slide, please. With this in mind, innovation and evaluation design are required to address health equity. Recent innovations in experimental case design may help to address these gaps through the ability to employ within subject experimental methods in small samples with reduced time and cost and increasing representation of marginalized and hard to reach communities in evidence-based interventions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Dallas Elgin.
Thank you, Lori. Hi, everyone. I'm Dallas Elgin, research scientist within RTI's health practice area. So randomized controlled trials are a powerful, rigorous tool for measuring the effectiveness of a new intervention or treatment, and they are often cited as a gold standard for program evaluation. Next slide, sorry, Ty. The strengths of RCTs are, of course, well documented. These include requiring limited assumptions, the ability to establish balance between treatment and control group participants on both observable and unobservable characteristics, and the ability to precisely estimate causal effects. However, RCTs are limited to specific research scenarios due to a combination of methodological and resource requirements. And notably, RCTs typically underrepresent racial and ethnic minorities, such as a historical underrepresentation of Black and African American populations, and underserved communities such as rural areas and tribal nations. As a result, RCTs offer a limited ability to develop and test culturally sensitive interventions that work for diverse populations. RCTs also require large sample sizes, with typically several hundred or more participants required in order to detect medium to small effect sizes. They can also be expensive and time-consuming, with many years invested to design, implement, and analyze the associated data. And they also rely on data that is collected anywhere from 3 to 6 months or even longer after the intervention. And this, of course, minimizes the methodology's ability to determine whether interventions are working in real time. The designs often require withholding treatment from control participants, which can pose ethical dilemmas. And they require strict protocols that often do not align with real-world settings. And then finally, they provide limited insight into the heterogeneity of intervention responses. Next slide, please. So the methodological requirements and limitations that we've noted can collectively result in RCTs being prohibitive or infeasible for evaluating many interventions and programs. And as Alan Kasdan notes, the collective effect is that the vast majority of programs are never evaluated. As an alternative, many agencies and organizations have elected to use rapid cycle evaluations. These methods continually collect data to assess changes over time, and they aim to obtain more regular feedback on an intervention's effectiveness. But many of the benefits of rapid cycle evaluations come at the expense of evaluative rigor, with these methods having limited ability to determine causal effects. Next slide, please. Experimental case designs offer critical, innovative opportunities to conduct rigorous evaluations of interventions that promote greater health equity. And these designs have been used for over 50 years in an array of fields, including psychology, education, medicine, and others. The methods are known by other names, such as single case designs, N of one, within subject designs, and idiographic clinical trials. And studies have also demonstrated increasing use of the methodology within recent years. While experimental case designs have a lengthy history, one might reasonably ask why these designs are not more widely used. And more widespread use of the methods is likely hindered by a combination of factors. These include limited instruction in graduate programs. The methodology has historically involved fewer participants, which has raised generalizability issues. The data collection requirements for repeated assessments of the outcome can also prove challenging. And there's been a historical reliance on visual inspection of plots rather than statistical testing to determine effectiveness. There's also been a typical lack of power analysis techniques for the methods and a lack of established design standards related to the number of cases, the number of baseline and treatment phases, the number of data points per phase, and also how to handle confounding factors. In the following slides, we'll discuss several advances that address these challenges and promote greater use of the designs. Next slide, please. Experimental case designs are a specific class of experimental designs that all share a common goal of assessing causal relationships between interventions and outcomes within one or more subjects. And the experimental nature of these designs is derived from the systematic manipulation of the intervention condition, with researchers determining when and how baseline and intervention conditions change. So to put this another way, the experimental nature of these designs is achieved by active manipulation of the intervention. There are typically 4 general requirements across the body of experimental case designs. Cases, whether consisting of individuals, groups, or even communities, are repeatedly assessed. The intervention's effects on one or more outcomes is assessed. A combination of baseline phases, which occur prior to the intervention, and intervention phases, which are concurrent with or after the intervention, are both included in the designs. And finally, there's the concept of stability of performance, where a case must achieve a stable rate of performance on an outcome during the baseline phase before the intervention is then introduced. Next slide, please. So next, we'll discuss the benefits and opportunities for using experimental case designs in health equity research before discussing a few prominent designs. Again, in contrast to RCTs, the methodology provides critical, innovative opportunities to conduct rigorous experimental evaluations of culturally sensitive and responsive interventions, and to more effectively identify interventions that promote greater equity. Several critical strengths of the methodology contribute to these benefits and opportunities for health equity research. These include the ability to conduct rigorous evaluations in populations and communities with small numbers of persons. The designs typically require less funding and time to complete than RCTs. There's also the ability to overlay the evaluation design within usual clinical protocols in real-world settings. Designs offer an approach to more closely link treatment and an intervention exposure to outcomes, such as detailed differential outcomes and within-person response processes. They also provide an opportunity to develop and test precision treatments where real-time data can be used to make treatments more effective during implementation. And they can provide increased representation of racial and ethnic minorities and underserved communities in developing these evidence-based treatments. Next slide, please. So next, we'll discuss several of the more prominent experimental case designs, beginning with the multiple baseline design. And in this design, multiple cases enter baseline at the same time, with each of the cases entering the intervention at a staggered time. Multiple baseline designs are the most common of these methods, accounting for an estimated 69% of experimental case designs. And the cases in the design can be multiple units with the same behavior in similar contexts, or they can be the same unit with multiple behaviors. The staggered baselines across cases provide increased confidence that the effects can be attributed to the intervention rather than extraneous events. And more cases increase confidence, and there is no limit, besides time and resources, on the number of cases that can be included. A pair of factors that affect the strength of the design consists of more rigorous designs having 3 or more cases, with each having both a baseline and intervention phase, and a minimum of 4 data points per phase. So the figure here on the right is from a study of an augmentative and alternative communication intervention that was delivered to a young boy with autism spectrum disorder via sessions with his grandmother, mother, and speech language pathologist. The intervention was associated with improved communication with each partner, which you can see in each of the plots, with the fastest growth occurring with the mother-delivered intervention, as shown here in the second plot. Next slide, please. So we'll next discuss a second prominent design, treatment reversal and withdrawal designs. And treatment reversal or withdrawal designs are characterized by a given case alternating between phases with and without the intervention. And the most common form is an AB-AB design, which consists of a baseline phase A, an intervention phase B, a return to baseline phase A, and a return to intervention phase B. The design is most appropriate for interventions where the effects reverse or decay at removal, and the intervention's impact is ideally seen at each baseline and intervention phase. A rigorous treatment reversal withdrawal design is typically characterized by having 4 or more phases and 3 or more data points per phase. The example graph is from a study involving 2 participants with severe unilateral neglect after a right hemisphere stroke. 2 weeks of conventional treatment during the baseline phases were then alternated with 2 weeks of visio-spatio-motor cueing during the intervention phases. Performance was assessed in 2 tests of lateral neglect. This includes the Bell's cancellation test, which is the top figure here, with lower scores indicating better performance, and the line bisection test, the bottom figure, with higher scores indicating better performance. And there was a statistically significant intervention-related improvement in participants' performance on the line bisection test here on the bottom, but not the Bell's test on the above. Next slide, please. So we've discussed the methodological and practical benefits of experimental case designs. We'll next discuss recent methodological advances. And notably, recent advances have significantly improved the methodology's rigor and further strengthened its ability to conduct rigorous evaluations of culturally sensitive and responsive interventions. Notable advances include the development of standards for rigorous designs, including those from the US Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse. There's also the use of meta-analysis and design comparable effect sizes to allow researchers to characterize the effects of multiple cases and/or designs into a common effect size, as well as the development of consort diagrams and power analysis methods, and the development and application of rigorous statistical analysis methods being applied to these designs, such as mixed effects or hierarchical linear models. And then finally, applications of experimental case designs at the community level. We discussed these last 2 advancements on the following slides, and I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Ty Reidenauer.
Thank you, Dallas. As Dallas said, my name is Ty Reidenauer. I am a developmental behavioral epidemiologist here at RTI International. I will be presenting several examples of what I refer to as idiographic clinical trials, which couple the traditional experimental case designs with rigorous statistical analyses. The goal of these presentations is to illustrate some of the advances in recent years. I'll be using studies that I have been involved with to illustrate these advances, but we're by no means the only camp in town. There are several groups that are working toward these goals. And there are many advances. This is a very rapidly moving field in an exciting ways, but we will illustrate some of these here. This study is illustrative of several aspects of ECDs that can have advantages for working with minoritized groups. One is that you can see here, this study consisted of 4 participants. So the small sample size can be handled with rigor and with quantification, which I'll show you here in a bit. This is a multiple baseline design. The study idea came from Dr. Pinio, who was a physician working with a nursing home. He observed that his patients who came to their unit with diabetes were consistently experiencing blood glucose problems to the extreme very shortly after they had been admitted. And so part of the issue that he had determined was that at the time, the gold standard was to use what's called a sliding scale. And in a sliding scale, the glucose levels are reviewed after 2 weeks, adjustments made to the insulin that they receive, and then it's re-reviewed 2 weeks later. The problem with that is that anyone who's familiar with glucose knows that glucose levels can bounce around dramatically even within a single day. So he devised what he called the manual pancreas. And in this approach, nurses would take glucose levels just before mealtime, enter the contents of a meal into an Excel file, and his algorithm would output a bolus dose of insulin to then give to the patient at the same time they receive their meal. Using this multiple baseline design, he was able to mimic how clinical services would be delivered. In other words, typically a phase of observation of symptoms is taken and then a treatment is tried. Depending on how that plays out in the response to that treatment, it may be changed again, but it's typically in that order as opposed to using a withdrawal design like what Dallas mentioned earlier. And that may be why multiple baseline designs are used so much. Regardless, you can see here that the baseline design is staggered among the 4 patients. In red are the glucose readings at 4 times per day over a 100 days period. So each participant had 400 observations. These data came from their clinical records, and so it required no additional effort on the part of the participants with this approach. Typically, in a traditional experimental case design, we would look at these data and draw a conclusion about the treatment effects. And in just looking at these in past presentations, people fairly readily see an effect for patient B following the baseline period, maybe patient D, but the others are not so clear whether there is a benefit or not from the intervention. One advantage to using rigorous analytics is we can clarify where those treatment effects are. We can test them for their statistical significance, or more recently, statisticians prefer statistical reliability in looking at the treatment effects. And here you can see there is both what's called a phase jump, meaning a difference at that starting point between the baseline and treatment phase, as well as the slope or the trend in glucose levels. Each of the participants did experience a significant or reliable effect. Some of them had a change in that effect over time, as indicated by the slope in that line. One thing to also that this illustrates is that each patient could receive the results of their own individual response to a treatment. This can have implications for successfully recruiting participants and retaining them in the study, such that one of the benefits of participation is you can return these results back to them, and they can then be able to make use of that information for their healthcare going forward. And just to break this down a little bit from hierarchical modeling, you can see where the intercepts from that model fit in and where the slopes fit in. Another illustration here is the meta-analysis that can be used in approaching these data that Dallas mentioned earlier. So we've got the 4 patients data here, and then the aggregate results are shown in the middle, where they are centered at the point in which baseline changes over to the treatment setting, the manual pancreas phase. And by centering them there, we can aggregate these data and get a trend in the yellow line that is the aggregate of all 4 participants. Another way that these data illustrate a use of these data potentially for minoritized populations is that we don't have to compare between any of these people or groups like you would in an RCT. For some Native American tribes, that is critical to their participation in research, where one of their fundamental tenets is not comparing between people, and can be a barrier to conducting RCTs. This next study is an illustration of how sophisticated these designs can get and how detailed the sorts of research questions can be addressed. Sticking with the glucose theme here, Bethany Rafe was attempting to develop an intervention to help adolescents increase the number of glucose tests that they take per day. This is a key component to them managing their glucose levels. And for adolescents, they very rarely achieve the clinical goal of 4 tests per day. So she had devised a contingency management approach and had 2 different types of contingency management. One that was linked directly to their behavior, called a contingent model, and one that was linked just to their participation in the study, which we refer to as non-contingent model here. Another complicating piece to this is that motivational interviewing had demonstrated effects for improving the number of glucose tests that adolescents completed per day. And Bethany wanted to demonstrate that their approach had benefits over and above what motivational interviewing provides. To further complicate things, there was suspicion that younger adolescents and older adolescents might respond differentially. So in this model, you can see the outline or the data that are shown here in terms of slopes are the number of tests per day appearing on the y-axis, and then time is appearing on the x-axis, as is typically done with these data. The pre-MI period is a true baseline period in which nothing was done. The participants were just completing their data reporting steps. Then the baseline period followed the delivery of motivational interviewing between days -5 and -6. And you can see that that increased on average the number of tests taken per day by 1. And then at 0 point was the beginning of contingency management. The reason that's day 0 is that in the data analyses, centering that transition into the treatment that you're most interested in at 0 helps the output to provide clearer ratings and easier interpretation. It does not have to be done that way. Also, in those first 2 phases, there's 1 line because the 4 anticipated groups did not differ in any way, and so they could be summarized with a single slope. However, when contingency management started, younger teens and those who received the 2 forms of contingency management responded differently. You can see here that the older teens, regardless of the form of contingency management that they got, responded as we had hoped and ended up using more than 4 glucose tests per day on average right away and maintain that benefit throughout the rest of the study. The younger teens, on the other hand, while they did receive some benefit, lost that benefit and returned basically to their baseline levels throughout that contingency management phase, which is shown between the 2nd and 3rd vertical lines. After that 3rd vertical line was a follow-up period in which contingency management was withdrawn and sustainment of the treatment effects was studied. So from this, we find that regardless of the contingency management program, the older teens responded very positively, younger teens not so much, and an alternative treatment approach may be needed for the younger teens, something like perhaps a different type of reward or incorporating the help of their parents. The point is that we were able to do very careful differential outcome analysis and comparative effectiveness research using this design. The sample size here was about 40 teens. And to the right, you can see the hierarchical multiple regression equation that imitate, that is the equivalent to what we also see graphically. I am, in the interest of time and question and answer, I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide. We could come back to it later if it would make sense to. This is an illustration of how we can use these designs at the community level rather than the individual participant level. In this approach, instead of subject or participant being an individual person, we instead look at the community level. This was a study that's is being led by Philip Graham and Anna Yaros here at RTI. They're interested in looking at how community organizing can impact or reduce adverse childhood experiences and violence in a community. In this particular case, the study is taking place in Milwaukee, and there were 10 communities of high interest where it was hoped that these programs could be especially effective. Their community organizing framework adheres to the Adverse Community Experiences and Resilience Prevention Framework, and I'm boiling this way down and not going into detail, but there are basically 3 strategies: equitable opportunities for those within the community, such as restorative practices, improving relationships among people and perceived norms, such as social norms, and places-based improvements, such as transportation. We used the idiographic clinical trial in this approach to randomize 10 communities to either receive this ACER approach or care as usual, with the outcomes coming from public records. And so this was also a budget-efficient way to approach collecting of data, processing of data, and the data themselves could have been tracked backwards and still could for years before the study begins as part of a baseline type of analysis. Some of the outcomes that we're looking at include violence, which can come from police data or emergency room records. Child maltreatment can be investigated through referrals to DCF, for example, and records of fighting can come from school records. We can also do, as we said, the randomized approach. We can also use a weighting approach using what are called distances to take census tract data and match communities across multiple census variables, such as level of education, race or ethnicity makeup, and use them into a single metric with these weightings, similar to what would be used in RCTs as propensity weighting. And then in this same approach, we can add control communities post hoc if they can be helpful in making sense of the results. This study is ongoing, so I don't have results to present, but just wanted to note that it is how it might be applied at the community level. A similar study was just funded by NIMH, in which, rather than communities, we're looking at clinics. This is a study that's being led by Michelle Andrasic and Brian Southwell to look at public health campaigns in combination with training and interventions that occur at the clinic level to try to increase enrollment in HIV vaccine trials. Minoritized communities have historically had poor or low participation in these vaccine trials, and it's of great interest to try to increase their enrollment involvement so that we can learn how to get these vaccines delivered to them more effectively. That's, as I said, that is a study that was just awarded, and stay tuned for the results. There we go. There's another advance that I would like to share that comes out of our group that is a software program we refer to as PersonAlytics. This development has been funded by the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. The specific interest there is in using these approaches to test treatments for rare diseases. However, it can be used in many other different treatment scenarios as well. This software is in the form of an R package, and so it's freely available to those who code in R. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the output. This is for models that use the hierarchical linear modeling or mixed effects modeling approach. And below that, you can see some of the graphics outputs that can come from these models. The linear regressions that I showed earlier for glucose levels also came out of this program. And we're working on developing a GUI interface for those who don't program in R, and you can see an example of that to the left. In addition to the statistical analysis PersonAlytics program, we have a power analysis program for planning studies, which we have found to be extremely useful in competing for federal funding, for example. This is the sort of information that reviewers expect to see as a way of justifying your planned study. And here too, we have graphics that we can check to make sure the settings that you have put into the program align with the results that you're anticipating. Power results are shown there at the bottom on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, we're also have a GUI interface available there that we're still tweaking and trying to refine and make the best that we can, but it is available at this point. We recently completed a Monte Carlo simulation study to evaluate how various factors in designing idiographic clinical trials compare to one another in their effect on statistical power, and how combinations of them help to enhance statistical power when planning your design. This was recently published the end of last year, and so it is available for reference. And having the results of those simulations can help to plan designs even without conducting the power analysis yourself. And it'll illustrate results from one of those simulations here. We investigated the interface between the effect size of a treatment, the number of participants recruited into the study, the number of time points of a study, and whether we're testing a phase jump or a gradual linear change as a treatment effect. To kind of hopefully clarify what we're looking at here, in the first, the small effect size column shows the results for a phase jump and linear change for small effect sizes. The next two over are medium effect sizes, and the far right two illustrations are for a large effect size. The number of persons in your study are color-coded by the lines. Those trends and number of time points are shown on the x-axis with power shown on the y-axis. The number of time points are always associated with large effect or improved power rather, up to a point. So for phase jumps, once you get into the medium effect size, the additional number of participants benefit to power gets reduced as you add more people. Once you get to a large effect size, having 100 participants doesn't really add that much of an advantage over having 20 or 40 participants in terms of your effect size, being able to detect your effect size rather. Also, when you're talking about increasing the number of time points, the benefit to power by adding number of time points helps mostly with detecting small effects. And once you start moving toward detecting a medium effect size, that payoff gets reduced. Once you're adding about 60 time points in your study, you're reaching a power of about 0.9. And so adding further time points out from that has minimal benefit, regardless of your sample size, when your effect size is greater than medium or large. Also, all things considered, it is easier to detect a phase jump compared to a gradual linear change, all of the things being equal. And so generally speaking, if you're trying to detect a slope, increasing number of time points, increasing number of participants, both work in your favor in terms of the power to detect an effect. There are a number of other Monte Carlo simulations that are there. One of the surprises that came out of this that I would like to point out here when designing the study is that having more time points during the baseline phase and the proportion of observations during the baseline phase helps to increase power. It's not shown here, but we were not anticipating that benefit to come out of it. So something to keep in mind as you're designing studies like this. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn this over to Carrie Ann to moderate our questions, and happy to field questions to any one of us. Thank you for your time.
So there is one question in the chat from Joseph Morris. And the question reads, so larger effect sizes overall have more stable intervention performance between baseline intervention and withdrawal? I think that was for Ty.
I'm not sure could you repeat that, Carrie Ann?
The question was on, it was just a couple of slides ago, I believe. It was for the power, it was for Ty and for the power analysis.
Okay.
Says, so larger effect sizes overall have more stable intervention performance between baseline intervention and withdrawal.
They will, with larger effect sizes, if I understand your question, and feel free to ask more or clarify or redirect me, but those larger effect sizes between say baseline and treatment is specifically what we looked at here, will give you more statistically reliable detection of that effect size. And similarly, if you're looking at the treatment effect and withdrawal effect, meaning after that treatment is ended and you're looking, for example, at sustainability of the treatment effects, then yes, the larger effect size, again, you'll be more likely to detect an effect. But that effect size in that case means that withdrawal would be accompanied with losing the benefit of the treatment, if that makes sense. So it would be a difference between those two phases. I hope that answers the question. If not, I'm happy to add more to it.
It seems to have, yes, thank you.
Okay.
We don't have any further questions. Okay, does anyone want to make any concluding comments? This is a very thorough presentation, and I appreciate everyone's time. Lori, did you want to say anything before we close? So we don't have additional Q&As to cover.
Yeah, I think we would just wrap by thanking everyone for coming. We know that this can be a new design for many people, and so we're excited to have so many people that are interested in it. We do think that it has broad applicability. As Carrie Ann mentioned at the top of the hour, we believe this can be a really effective tool for larger national evaluations, but also as a tool that can be utilized by subgrantees, awardees, and there can be a lot of support provided to those organizations as they move forward with the mandate, often by their federal funding agencies, to conduct local evaluations. And so we're excited to be able to share this methodology and look forward to receiving questions. There is a QR code on the screen right now, and a link has been shared in the chat that if you would like additional information or if you have additional questions for us, please feel free to send those along, and we'd be excited to engage you in a conversation and try to address those questions. I see that there's a question of when you all will receive slides. Carrie Ann, do you know how long it usually takes to turn around?
Lydia's typing an answer, but I believe it's pretty rapid. You'll get a link in your email with to the email where you registered for the webinar. So
great. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time today and look forward to engaging in additional dialogue around this exciting method. Have a great afternoon.